Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, at least 8 people are dead and around 40 pulled alive from the rubble of a collapsed building in Lagos. Many of the victims are school children who were at class on the top floor when it came down. Also, Emmanuelle Macron becomes the first French head of state to visit Kenya since independence. He's there ahead of a climate conference, but also as part of a tour of East Africa from which he's hoping to drum up some big business. And that Kenyan meeting I mentioned is the One Planet Summit, which is set to kick off on Thursday. We take a look ahead to the event that brings together heads of state and business leaders in the fight against climate change. But first, at least 8 people have been killed after a school building collapsed in Lagos on Wednesday. By evening, at least 37 people had been pulled alive from the rubble of the 4-storey structure. As many as 100 children are thought to have been inside when it went down. Others may have been trapped in the debris, as there were several residential apartments below that top floor where the school operated. Distraught parents watched on as search and rescue efforts continued into the night. Our Sam Olukoya spent much of the day at the collapse site, and he joins us now with more. Sam, do we know what happened?
Well, it's really unclear as to what exactly happened. What eyewitnesses said was that the building came down very suddenly. There was no warning. It was difficult for anybody to escape. The whole thing was very, very sudden.
And do you have any update on the number of victims and how many might still be trapped inside?
Well, the National Emergency Agency issued a statement this evening. It was issued just about the time I left, and they said 37 people were rescued alive, and then 8 were dead. As the time I left, 2 more people were pulled out. One was dead, the other was alive. So I don't know whether these 2 figures were added to it or whether these are fresh, were not added to that. Otherwise, we shall be talking of almost 47 people pulled out so far. But then, even as at the time I was leaving, there were indications that there were people still trapped. Rescue workers had made contacts with some people still under the rubble. So definitely there are still a number of people still trapped under the rubble.
So tell us more about what the building was used for. We know that there was a school inside, but what about the other floors?
It was like a multi-purpose building. You had a school, you had residential apartments, and you also have a number of shops, which is not peculiar to this particular building. I mean, all the buildings there were used for several purposes, and this has to do with the fact that there's so much pressure for land in this place, and every available space is very strongly utilized. And apparently, there are no regulations there as to what buildings could be used for. The buildings there are in very bad state. Even while I was there, I was a bit scared that some of these buildings can still collapse as work was going on. So it's quite a terrible place to go, and it's quite sad that this happened.
So you were there for most of Wednesday. From what you saw, how are rescue services trying to get to those they believe are still buried under the rubble?
It's a very difficult and slow process. More of people using their hands, carrying things with their hands. There's just one heavy machine, which was not able to do much. In a situation where people are trapped, you expect to have more of heavy machines carrying all these blocks up, but most of the work is being done by hand. And of course, because it's a very highly populated area, you have so many people who have no business being there, hampering rescue efforts. So it's of course, you have relatives also who are anxious about their relatives that have not been accounted for.
Thanks very much, Samuel Olukoya, there for us in Lagos. Now, France's Federal Agency for Air Accident Investigations will analyse the black boxes from the Ethiopian Airlines plane that crashed on Sunday, killing all 157 people on board. It's the second unexplained disaster involving a Boeing 737 in less than 5 months. 189 people were killed in October in Indonesia. And following Sunday's crash, the aircraft were grounded in much of the world. On Wednesday, the US finally took steps to also suspend flights of the jet, saying that it was because of new evidence gathered at the Ethiopian impact site. And at least 115 people were killed in Mozambique, Malawi and South Africa in flash floods caused by torrential rains. Mozambique's declared a red alert as a tropical cyclone and more downpours are expected later this week. That goes for neighbouring Malawi as well. There, a state of disaster was declared last week. At least 56 people there have died because of the extreme weather, and more than 230,000 left without shelter. Storms began about a week ago, causing rivers to burst their banks, submerging villages and knocking out power supplies. Well, France's president was in Nairobi on Wednesday in the first ever visit to Kenya by a French head of state since its independence. After Djibouti and Ethiopia, Kenya was the third stop on Emmanuelle Macron's trip through East Africa this week. He's in the country for an environmental summit that kicks off on Thursday, but also as part of a charm offensive in the region. He's announced about €3 billion worth of deals on Kenya. And Nicola Chamat from our Africa desk is here to shed more light on all of that. Nick, do France and Kenya have much of a history in terms of doing business together?
Not much, and this is one of the aims of his trip to East Africa. And you could tell it was a business-oriented trip because he was accompanied by many French CEOs, the CEOs of big firms in the sectors of the gas, electricity, telecommunications. You could also tell it was an important trip for him because, with the crisis of the yellow vests in France, he's cancelled many trips abroad. This one, he didn't want to cancel it. It's a 4-day trip. It's the longest trip abroad since the beginning of the yellow vest crisis in October. He chose to go to two of the most dynamic countries in Africa, Ethiopia and Kenya. Ethiopia, 100 million inhabitants, 8% economic growth. He promised 100 million euros of aid to Ethiopia and to support its army. Also, with the new Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia, some sectors are going to be partially privatized, such as the telecommunications sector, and this interested several French CEOs. It was the first visit of a French president to Ethiopia since 1973, so you see that France has really neglected East Africa for a long time. As you said, for Kenya, it was even worse. It was the first visit since independence in 1963. In Kenya, 50 million inhabitants, 6% growth. The French firm signed deals for €3 billion, and they're going to build, among other things, a motorway and a railway line.
So that's some pretty big investment from France in Kenya and in Ethiopia. But we know that China's already got a bit of a leap on France in that part of the continent. Does France have much to rival China's foothold in Kenya? Well,
this is part of the reason for this trip, that France had neglected East Africa. Even Djibouti, which used to be a French colony, Nicolas Sarkozy hadn't been there. The last president was Nicolas Sarkozy, who went there in 2010. And what happened is that the Chinese in 2017 built a Chinese military base there. It's their only military base outside China, and they built it just next to the French military base in Djibouti. Another interesting fact is that China funded the railway line between Djibouti and Addis Ababa in 2016. And that's very symbolic because the last time there had been a railway line built between Djibouti and Addis Ababa, that was in 1917 by the French and the Ethiopians. So you can really see the change there. Also, it's interesting to note that the volume of trade between China and Africa has been multiplied by 20 these last 2 decades. And this is what Emmanuelle Macron said about China, and I'm not sure Beijing will like this. I'm going to quote him. "I would not want international investments to weaken the sovereignty of our partners. French companies are able to offer a respectful partnership." And finally, Emmanuel Macron wanted to show that France isn't only thinking about business, but also about culture. So he said that France would promise to conserve and restore Ethiopia's national heritage, especially the magnificent churches in Lalibela in the north of Ethiopia. These churches, which are carved in stone below ground level and part of the World Heritage Site.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Nick. Emmanuel Macron attacking on all fronts and trying to woo East Africa there. But another reason, as I mentioned, that Macron is in Kenya is for the 3rd edition of the One Planet Summit, which is due to set to kick off on Thursday. That event brings together heads of state and business leaders in a fight to combat climate change. Going out to Ellen Gainsford, who tells us more.
It's the first edition of the One Planet Summit to be held in Africa. The event aims to speed up action on climate change, with a focus on protecting African populations and biodiversity. Speaking ahead of the summit, the president of the World Bank said it was vital that the nations least responsible for global warming are assisted to adapt to the extreme weather and food insecurity their citizens face.
Africa contributes 4% of CO2 emissions globally, but already more than 65% of the population there is impacted by climate change, by drought, by flooding, by storms.
This Wednesday, the World Bank announced it's to provide $22.5 billion for sustainable development projects in Africa between 2021 and 2025. The summit aims to unite private and state actors in the battle to combat climate change, bringing together African leaders, entrepreneurs, and international organizations to create green economic opportunities and showcase innovative projects which will help create the low-carbon economy of the future. Host Kenya is already setting a good example. The country runs off 75% of renewable energy and has banned the use of plastic bags. Kenya has had to battle extreme weather in recent years. In 2017, the country faced a severe drought, while in 2018, heavy flooding displaced hundreds of thousands of people.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.
The world is ever changing. The news doesn't wait. That's why at France 24, we'll always be there to help make sense of world events. For the best international coverage, 24 hours a day, no matter what, France 24 is with you everywhere, all the time.